Madam President, back in 2008, then Senator Obama said that under his policies, energy costs would necessarily, and I quote, skyrocket, end quote. And that he would, and I quote again, have preferred a gradual adjustment to higher gasoline prices. So he indicated at the time that under his policies, energy prices were going to go up. He mentioned that he would like a more gradual adjustment, but when he talked about those policies, he said that energy costs would necessarily, and I quote, skyrocket. Well, I think that we now know, Madam President, which of the campaign promises that the President has kept, because we have seen energy prices skyrocket for most Americans. In fact, gasoline prices have doubled under President Obama's watch. If you look at January of 2009, the price per gallon of gasoline was $1.85. Today it's $3.73, and some analysts are predicting $5 a gallon gasoline by May of this year. Now, today marks the 24th straight day of gasoline price increases. Now, the problem with all this, Madam President, is that the President rhetorically, when he goes out and talks about energy, says that he wants an all-of-the-above strategy. Now, they always say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and obviously that is a phrase that many of us as Republicans have been using for some time. We talk about an all-of-the-above strategy that includes oil and gas and clean coal and nuclear and biofuels and solar and wind and all of those things. The problem with what the President says is that his actions say that he really means none of the above. He says all of the above, but he means none of the above, because the President has taken unprecedented steps to restrict access to America's affordable and reliable sources of oil and natural gas. President Obama's energy policies are increasing the costs of gasoline in this country. His administration is pursuing new regulations that will increase the cost of domestic energy production and destroy jobs. Madam President, more domestic production of energy in this country equals lower prices at the pump and more American jobs. Now, the President's statements have been punctuated, if you will, or reinforced by members of his administration. Again, I go back to 2008. Dr. Stephen Chu, who is now President Obama's Energy Secretary, said at the time, and I quote, "Somehow we have to figure out how to boost the price of gasoline to the levels in Europe," end quote. Think about that, Madam President. Somehow we have to figure out how to boost the price of gasoline to the levels in Europe. Well, if you look at the levels in Europe, I think even at that time you were talking about $9 to $10 per gallon of gasoline. And so you have members of his very administration suggesting, Madam President, even back then, that part of the strategy, the energy strategy, was to increase prices. Think about that, as having an energy strategy that is actually going to drive up the cost of energy to people in this country. Well, yesterday, in testimony before the House Appropriations Committee, now Secretary Chu, who said back in 2008 that somehow we have to figure out how to boost the price of gasoline to the levels in Europe, was asked, is the overall goal to get the price of gasoline down? That was asked by a member of the House of Representatives, again, as Secretary Chu was testifying in front of the House Appropriations Committee. Is the overall goal to get our price of gasoline down? This is what the Secretary said. No. The overall goal is to decrease our dependency on oil to build and strengthen our economy. Well, Madam President, when you are doubling, literally doubling the price per gallon of gasoline, how does that strengthen your economy? Small businesses are faced every single day with high costs of energy. It's an important part, an important component of running a business in this country. Energy is probably one of the most important costs that people are going to deal with. It certainly is in my part of the country, where I represent an agricultural economy. But American families are looking at gasoline prices that literally have doubled since this president took office. And yet, here his Secretary of Energy, the very guy who was to guide energy policy in this country, in front of a House committee as recently as yesterday, when asked about the overall goal, says that about whether the overall goal is to get the price of gasoline down, says no. No. It squares perfectly with what he said 4 years ago when he indicated that we need to figure out to somehow boost the price of gasoline to the levels in Europe. Well, that is an amazing, amazing statement. I think probably almost incomprehensible to the American people in terms of what it means to their daily lives, because they're the people who ultimately in their pocketbooks have to deal with the consequences of bad policies. And bad policies that raise the price of energy in this country makes it more difficult for them to balance their budgets and to be able to continue to enjoy a standard of living and a quality of life in this country. Yesterday, President Obama's Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar, defended the Obama administration's failure of an energy policy when testifying before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And he said this, he said, "We have an energy strategy, and a policy that we've been working on from day one, and we believe it continues to show good results." Now think about that. We have an energy strategy and a policy that we've been working on from day one. We believe it continues to show good results. Well, I don't know how you can argue that doubling the price for a gallon of gasoline is a good result, and literally taking areas out of production in this country that could be yielding energy that would help reduce the dependence that we have on foreign sources of energy, drive down the price at the pump, and create American jobs is a good result. I don't know how you can argue that the things that have happened here during this administration's time in office have been anything but disastrous for the American people, for American business, and for the continued dependence that we have on foreign sources of energy. Of course, we all know that President Obama rejected the Keystone XL pipeline, which would have created 20,000 shovel-ready jobs and delivered up to 830,000 barrels of oil per day from Canada, America's largest trading partner. President Obama has reduced the number of new offshore leases by half. President Obama has blocked exploration and production on 97% of offshore areas. 97% of those areas that could be useful in helping meet America's energy needs have been put off limits by this president, by their policies, which have blocked exploration and production in those very areas. Under the Obama administration, new permits to drill in federal onshore and offshore areas have declined by 40 to 50%. That, Madam President, is the President's record on energy. So how his Secretary of the Interior could come up and say that their energy strategy shows good results is beyond me. I mean, it is completely at odds with the reality and with the facts, Madam President. The Obama administration is implementing a national backdoor energy tax through unprecedented regulations of greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. In fact, President Obama specifically targeting the oil and gas industry with new regulations such as new source performance standards, Boiler Act, Tier 3 gasoline standards that could drive up the cost of gasoline production by up to 25 cents a gallon. It could raise the refining industry's operating costs by $5 billion to $13 billion annually, lead to a 7 to 14% reduction in gasoline supplies from U.S. refiners, and force as many as 7 U.S. refiners to shut down. That's the Tier 3 gasoline standard that the administration is proposing. And so time after time again, opportunity after opportunity missed, this president continues to put policies in place that make it more difficult, more expensive to create jobs in this country, and that raise the cost of doing business by raising the cost of energy and raising the cost that every American consumer has to deal with in the form of higher gasoline prices. So when he says that he supports an all-of-the-above energy plan, his policies tell, Madam President, a very, very different story, because his policies have discouraged increased production of oil, and high oil costs are indeed a key driver of gasoline costs. Republicans support a real all-of-the-above strategy that includes production in all the sources of energy, includes support of projects like the Keystone XL pipeline that will strengthen North America's energy security. And we've got to have a robust energy plan that's focused on increasing those areas of domestic production that would send a strong signal to energy markets around the world and make America less vulnerable to skyrocketing gasoline prices. It's interesting, Madam President, that the response up here on Capitol Hill to this spike in gasoline prices that we have seen here over the past several days is along these lines. There was a letter that went from Senator Schumer to Secretary Clinton a couple of days ago in which he talked about the skyrocketing fuel prices, directly linked those to the global energy market, but suggested that the solution should be urging the State Department to work with the government of Saudi Arabia to increase its oil production to its actual capacity of 12.5 million barrels to help stabilize markets. So instead of developing American resources and actually doing something that would lessen the dependence that we have on these foreign sources of energy, the solution proposed by some of our, at least of our Democrat colleagues, is to go to have the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, go to the Saudis, hat in hand, and to beg them to increase daily production by 2.5 million barrels. Ironically, at the very time that they are blocking policies that would help generate that same 2.5 million barrels a day right here in the United States and stabilize world markets. In fact, if you look at many of these areas that are off limits to production today, North Slope of Alaska, the Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf, the Eastern Gulf of Mexico, the Pacific Outer Continental Shelf, the Keystone XL pipeline, if you add up, Madam President, the amount of production that would bring to our country, it adds up to 4.5 million barrels per day. 4.5 million barrels per day of additional energy production that we could be benefiting from and enjoying in this country at a time when we're seeing gas prices literally double. And of course, in accordance with the President's promise when he was running for office that prices were going to skyrocket, it shouldn't come as any surprise. But these energy policies implemented by this administration and have literally created a situation where we're now having to go and ask the Saudis, please, would you please give us an additional 2.5 million barrels of oil a day instead of opening up the areas in this country that could generate up to 4.5 million barrels per day if we would simply develop the resources that we have in this country and quit blocking the access to these important energy resources. Madam President, this is a fairly straightforward issue to the American people. One, because it hits very squarely in their everyday lives. The pocketbook issues are issues, the bread and butter issues, the issues that people discuss around their kitchen tables every day are the issues that I think are most important to Americans, particularly right now in a down economy with a high unemployment rate. And certainly what we're seeing in terms of energy costs makes worse that situation for American families. In fact, the payroll tax holiday, which was extended a couple of weeks ago, will actually be eaten up. Any savings that might be achieved to the American families' pocketbooks will literally be eaten up simply paying for the higher cost of gasoline that is going to be imposed on every American family as a result of these higher prices, again, that are simply a matter of us not having enough supply. This is a market situation. Gasoline is a global commodity. It is something that when you have more supply, it brings the price down. And when you've got more domestic production in this country, it means two things. It means lower prices at the pump for American consumers, and it means more jobs for American workers. And blocking access to American sources of energy production means higher prices at the pump for American consumers and fewer jobs for American workers. It is that straightforward, it is that simple. The American people understand that, and that's why the policies that this administration is pursuing, and clearly, Madam President, from the statements that are being made by these members of the President's administration, from Secretary Chu to Secretary Salazar to the President himself, suggest, if you can believe this, unfathomable, I'm sure, to many Americans, that it is intentional to actually push those prices higher. That is what Secretary Chu said back in 2008. We need to boost our prices to the level that they're seeing in places like Europe. I think the American people believe differently about that. I believe they deserve better. They want policies that will lower the cost of energy in this country, make America less dependent upon dangerous foreign regimes. And I know that many of us here, Republicans in the Senate, are ready to go to work on putting those policies in place if the President and his allies here in the United States Senate will give us that opportunity. Madam President, I yield the floor.